All right, let's go ahead and get started, Bronwyn, because we want to make sure that we are being very cautious or conscious of y'all's time today.
Mhm.
We know your time is precious, and we are very grateful to be spending
Mhm.
this afternoon
Yes.
with you
Yeah.
guys.
Okay.
My name is Amanda Elkanick Oder, and I am the Chief Advocacy and Education Officer here at Texas Advocacy Project. Bronwyn, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Bronwyn Blake. I'm the Chief Legal Officer here at Texas Advocacy Project.
We are excited to present the findings from our most recent publication, which is Protective Orders in Texas 2025 Statewide Survey on County Policies and Practices. In our time today, we're going to be going through a lot of information. We are recording this presentation, and we will send the recording out to you. So if you wish to share that with anybody in your office, please feel free to do so. If you do not want your face on the camera, since it is being recorded, please feel free to turn your cameras off. We will also be monitoring the chat throughout our time today. Bronwyn and I will be answering, and then Kayla will help us if we miss anybody. But let's go ahead and jump into the content. So first and foremost, we want to give a big thank you to the Texas Bar Foundation for their generous funding for this project. And then let's talk about who we are. So Texas Advocacy Project has been around for 43 years. We are a statewide nonprofit law firm, and we exclusively represent victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and child abuse. We do not have geographic restrictions on our services, meaning we serve all 254 counties across Texas. We have strong partnerships with
Oh,
over
that lady was at the
150
conference.
organizations across the
That
state.
black lady.
Those organizations vary from domestic violence agencies, sexual assault organizations, human trafficking organizations, district attorneys' offices, like some of y'all, law enforcement agencies. And we have a incredible team of attorneys at Texas Advocacy Project who are providing those free legal services for survivors. Do you want to add anything to that, Bronwyn?
Well, I'm grateful for you guys letting us introduce ourselves to you. If you all would like to introduce yourselves in the chat and share where you're from, everyone should be able to read that chat and connect with you that way.
Awesome. This is a quick snapshot of how many people Texas Advocacy Project serves, and then also some statistics about how common domestic violence and human trafficking and sexual assault are both across the nation and the state. One important point that I want to show everyone on the screen is that last year we served over 6,200 primary survivors across the state. That is a 20%, about a 20% increase from years past. We've done a lot of work at the Texas Advocacy Project over the last year, really looking internally at our systems, trying to increase the efficiencies within those systems in order to serve more survivors. And we saw the benefit of that this last year and being able to serve more survivors by like over 20%. So um, you can also see on your screen here that 72% of TAP clients were living at or below 125% of the federal poverty line. But it is important for us to note that Texas Advocacy Project does not have an income requirement to receive our services. All
Amanda, we
right.
have quite a range of different disciplines and agencies. This is a great group for us to speak to. I've been watching the chat and welcome all of you. Thank you for sharing the agencies where you work.
This is great. It looks like every region of Texas so far is being represented.
Wonderful.
Awesome. Okay, so today, a couple of things that we're going to be covering. First, we want everybody, if this is like your first training, your first week on the job, we want everybody to have some foundational knowledge about what a protective order is and what it isn't in the state of Texas. Um, we'll talk about different ways that it's referred to in other states. Very generally, we're not going to go into the full legal scope of what a protective order is. We have a whole nother presentation for that. And if you're interested in it, please reach out to our team. Then we're going to dive into the analysis of how protective orders are being implemented across the state of Texas. And then we'll end today with what Texas Advocacy Project is doing and how we can partner with you in your communities. So let's start with what a protective order is.
Yeah, I know we have some real expertise here on this webinar. So we said basics of protective orders. I'm going to be really choosy. I'm only going to talk about the basics that I want to make sure we're all on the same page about, because some of the questions that we asked in our survey were to see, is everybody in Texas on the same page? So let's go ahead and advance. We have a basic definition of a protective order here on the screen. We know it's a court order. It's part of a civil remedy process. We have different types of protective orders in Texas. But on the next slide, we say, hey, is it just a piece of paper? I hear this a lot. I'm sure some of y'all have heard it. And it is a piece of paper. I'm not going to lie to you, but we know that it's the most effective tool we have to keep people safe. There's a variety of studies on how effective they are. They've turned in data to show they're anywhere from 30% effective in preventing future violence all the way up to 80% effective in preventing future violence. This quote we have on the screen is from the latest survey. This one's self-reported. It's out of Kentucky, but this is the very latest data we have on how effective protective orders are. We know that legal services is the only intervention that directly correlates with a decrease in domestic violence. So I'm a big fan. I think protective orders are important and protective orders work. So I do want to establish that baseline and make sure we're all on the same page about that before we go on. Now, here in Texas, we have a pretty robust list of types of victimizations for which you are eligible to receive a protective order. We started with family violence protective orders. When I started in this work over 20 years ago, we were adding dating violence protective orders to that definition. Texas has also, over the years, expanded. There's a real trend in our law. Amanda and I will highlight it for you, that the laws get more and more protective and more expansive. So we added sexual assault protective orders. We added human trafficking protective orders. And now we've added stalking protective orders, which includes harassment. So this is a nice list. There's a few states out there that offer an elder abuse protective order. Maybe that's in the future for our Texas law, but right now I'm pretty happy. This is where our Texas law stands right now, and I think this is a great list. Now, another thing that we have in Texas, I want to make sure we're all on the same page about, is we have a law that says we have to use mandatory protective order forms. So we have an application that needs to be used when you apply for a protective order, and we have a version of a final order that needs to be used. You're allowed to add things to those orders, but the law does require use of these forms. This law was passed in 2019. It was called Monica's Law. So it's been 7 years now. We've actually had improvements to our Texas law in those intervening years, and these forms have been updated. So the agency that's in charge of these is our Texas Office of Court Administration. They have these forms on their website, and they do keep them updated. We've had forms for a long time. I remember when I was in college as a volunteer at Texas Advocacy Project, all the law clerks were busy editing forms. Those were forms people could use. Pro se litigants, people representing themselves, could go use those forms, but now they're mandatory. So, little teaser, one of the questions we asked in our survey, we'll go over our methodology in a minute, but one of the questions we asked was, are you using those forms? And less than half of the county said that they were. So I think that's an interesting finding. This is just a teaser that shows we're not all on the same page. And as we go through some more questions later in our slide deck, you'll see we're not all on the same page. But right away, we have a law. These are the forms to be used. They are updated, but we're not all using them. So we'll talk about the ramifications of that as well. Do you want to go look at those forms? You can pull up your cell phone and scan that QR code. We can also chat a link, or you can go to the OCA's website. We have the URL at the bottom to direct you to those forms if you want to check them out. Okay, so I want to clarify something. We actually have 3 types of protective orders in Texas. I think Most of y'all on this probably know that. This is pretty cool about Texas. I like to point out cool things about our laws. Most states just have two types of protective orders. They have a more, urgent one and then a longer term one. And we have so many. That first one is the odd man out. The magistrate's order of emergency protection is only available in a case where it is part of the criminal justice system, where, law enforcement has been involved and an arrest has been made. And it's at the point where the respondent who's been arrested is being magistrated that a magistrate can issue that type of order. So those are special. I want you to push them over here out of your mind, because what we're really going to talk about today is this temporary ex parte protective order and the final protective order. These two go together. And unlike the magistrate's order of emergency protection, it's up to the survivor if they want to go apply for one. It's completely up to them. They can go apply for this if they think it's a protective order, keep them safe. Protective orders aren't for everybody. You have to make a decision. Is this right for you? But if they do want to go apply for them, they're meant to work together. The temporary ex parte protective order is meant to keep you safe until you can have your hearing for your final protective order. So those two go hand in hand, and they are part of a civil process. So the reason that we're focusing on those two in our survey is because in our Texas Family Code, we have a law that says that if somebody's in need of a protective order, it's their local county or district attorney who's meant to help them with those orders. So we really focused in on that.
One thing that I'll note on this slide, as we mentioned earlier, as Bronwyn mentioned earlier, that our protective order statute has been evolving over the past decades. This past legislative session, with the help of Representative Manuel's office, we had an expansion of our magistrate's order of emergency protection orders. Again, we're not going to be going into great detail, but I do think it's important to note, while we do have a captive audience, that magistrate's orders of emergency protection before September 1st of last year were good for 31, 61, or 91 days. And with the passage of this legislation, they are now in effect for 61, 91, or 121 days. So when we're looking at this scheme of different types of protective orders, we're really looking at how much time in between survivors have. So a survivor can have one or all three of these throughout their journey of trying to access protection and safety. And that temporary ex parte protective order is good for 20 days. And then that final protective order is good for anywhere between 2 years to a lifetime. Again, we're not going to get into a whole bunch of the details, but while we have you here, I think it is important just to give that basic information around it.
Okay, so I think so far made sure we're all on the same page. Some protective order basics, check. I don't want to waste any more time. Let's jump into the report, Amanda.
Yes, please. Okay, so there was an initial report for this protective order study that was done in 2013. At that time, I was at the Texas Council on Family Violence. That protective order report was done in partnership with the Texas Council on Family Violence, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, and who did I miss? Us.
Us.
There it is. So all four organizations worked together to reach out to all 254 counties across Texas. And at that time, there had not been any study that had been done to try to figure out what the policies and the procedures were in individual prosecutors' offices around how they were implementing the protective order statute. It's important to note that policy and practice are two very different things. What we have written in legislation and then what individual offices were doing or not doing were two different things. So maybe in the protective order statute, it didn't say that there needed to be a recency in violence, but in different offices, there was a recency of violence. And we'll get into a little bit more of that because that's a very specific question that we asked in both studies. We asked different questions in this year, in 2024, 2025, to these different prosecutors' offices because of those legislative changes that have happened over the last 10 years, over a little bit over 10 years now. But for over 10 years, since that original report was written, Texas Advocacy Project has worked with our law clerks that we get every spring break to keep this database updated. That was really important for our staff because we are practitioners and we needed to understand where survivors could access a protective order and where they couldn't. So our attorneys were using that information. Bronwyn, I'll let you talk a little bit more about why that was important.
Yeah, let's go ahead and advance. Amanda's being modest. Back in 2013, she published that report, those 2013 findings. So, Amanda, let's harken back to 2013. It was a simpler time in our world. What were just a couple of the main findings back then? And then we'll fast forward to the future.
Yeah, for sure. So, a couple of things that we found in that original report was that more than half of the counties that have responded to that original report required police reports from survivors who were trying to access protective orders. Again, that is not a requirement in our state legislation for accessing protective orders, but more than half of the counties across Texas had required that. In addition, we saw lower prosecution rates of violations for protective orders. This is important to note because we'll see what happened and the results that we found in this most recent study.
Okay, now we're fast forwarding to the future. Amanda did share in the intervening years, Texas Advocacy Project. We did keep up to date on this. So back in 2012, 2013, I was one of the lawyers making those phone calls to the counties. How do you handle protective orders? But then when I started running our client services department here, I realized why our own staff would need that information. Amanda shared we've had a 20% increase in efficiency and effectiveness on our numbers this year at TAP, and we've always been wanting to be as efficient and effective as possible. So, if we got a call from a survivor in a county where their local prosecutor would help them get a protective order, and then a call from a survivor where there weren't resources to help them, that would help us decide where to deploy our lawyers and our services. So we kept up to date on this. But we started getting calls from sister organizations saying they wanted to have this information too. And I realized we needed to clean it up a bit. So that is why we decided in 2025 to do our due diligence, our very best, and let's do the best job we can on collecting that data one more time before we publish this update. So we had some pro bono spring break law clerks. Instead of going to the beach, they got on the phones and started calling all of you who are coming to us from local county and district attorneys. And they called the same places we've been calling for a decade. Some people said, stop, ask us these same questions. Nothing's changed. Great, check. We know your answers, right? But there were some people that we couldn't get on the phone. So we got the contact information for the elected officials, sent them a letter. We either said, here's the information we've gotten from your office. Do you want to confirm it? Or we said, hey, we haven't been able to reach you. Do you want to participate in our survey? We also emailed these same offices and people. There were still some people that were not responding. So we did comb and scrape the internet for information about protective orders in those counties. Some counties have great websites that say what to do and where to go if you need a protective order in that jurisdiction, and some do not have any information. And, if I've been practicing survivor law, doing family law and protective orders for 20-something years, and I can't figure out where to go to get a protective order in that county, I think that's kind of a problem. So, bottom lining this, everyone had a chance to participate. So we're going to share the information from those that chose to respond. But right up here on your screen, you have some of the big findings. These are, some of the questions that we asked. And if we, I guess I want to share one last thing. To kind of make a good comparison, we asked, Amanda said those same questions from 2012, 2013, because we wanted to see how things had changed. But then she shared, we did add some questions just for things in the law that have updated. So here's a nice summary. Back in 2012, 2013, we didn't have human trafficking and stalking and protective orders. So we asked now, hey, now that we have these, do you help with these? We didn't have standardized forms back then. So now that we have them, we asked, are you using them? You already saw that pie chart. Another thing on here that's a big change is we now have a protective order registry in Texas. This is a big improvement in our law. We didn't decide to ask a question about that because we know who's participating in the protective order registry and who has an opportunity to improve their participation, because this is run by the Office of Court Administration, and when a PO is registered, they know who registered it. So that's one we chose not to ask about. Okay, so I want to talk about high level responses, what's working and what's not working.
Before you go into that, Bronwyn, I want to go back to this slide just for 1 second so that we can also talk about some of the statistics of what's changed here in Texas. From that original report that we had in 2013, we looked at has violence against intimate partners increased in the state of Texas? And what we found is that there's been an increase by 32% of those family violence incidents in Texas. And we can get that information from Texas DPS. So we analyzed all of that data. In addition, we looked at has there been any trends within our court system or different patterns for people applying for protective orders? And so when we did that research, we found, yeah, there's been an 11% increase in the amount of people trying to access a protective order. And that was just since 2023. So it's been, over years has increased even more. It's important to note there's a gap in that. We see an increase in family violence incidents by 32%, and we see an increase in people applying for protective orders by 11%. So where are those other survivors going and how are they getting and staying safe? So we really wanted to look at that. We also know with the Texas Council on Family Violence publishes a report every single year called Honoring Texas Victims. And so we saw in that Honoring Texas Victims report in 2024 that there were 161 people who were killed by their current or former intimate partner. And out of those out of those victims who were murdered by their partners, 13 perpetrators had a current or prior magistrate's order of emergency protection, and one had an active protective order. So when we look at those numbers, 161 people who had been killed by their partner, 13 of those abusers who had killed their partner had a magistrate's order of emergency protection, and only one of those victims had a protective order. We know that going back to that original study that had been done that shows that protective orders can actually save lives. We know protective orders can save lives, but we needed to have the data to prove that as well. And so I just kind of wanted to preface before we move on to what's working here in the state and what we have found has been working to kind of level it out so that we know that domestic violence is increasing, but the increased rate of accessing protective orders isn't meeting that demand. Okay.
Yeah. So we should go into this with that question in our head. Why is there a difference in the increase in violence, but not as many people accessing protective orders?
Not Gann's dog. He quickly became.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so I can start out a little bit with this slide because collaboration is my favorite thing. I really, really, really love collaborating. We have really strong partnerships across the state. But one of the things that we found through this study is that there have been more prosecutors' offices that are partnering with local organizations in a coordinated community response and in those high risk teams. So we're seeing that what's working, collaboration within communities is increasing. And I'll show you some statistics on the next slide. We also know that there's been an expansion of the statutory protections. We've gone over that in a few slides already. These standardized forms have increased both clarity and have improved uniformity in some areas. Those some areas are the ones that are implementing using those standardized forms. And then we're also seeing, which was really good to see in this 2025 report, we're seeing that PO violations are actually being enforced at increased rate versus that 2013 report.
Yeah, remember Amanda shared the 2013 data that enforcement wasn't as prevalent. I love this, as a lawyer, if I'm going to go get an order, it's not worth anything unless you're willing to enforce it. So this is wonderful. It's on your list. Thank you.
Okay, so let's look at some of the data. Here's another pie chart. Bronwyn and I just got back from a conference in College Station. And so she was talking about the pies and how much of the pie we're eating. And we're eating a lot of this pie. Okay, so do you actively collaborate with your local shelter or advocacy groups to coordinate safety, planning, or other services for protective order applicants? And out of this question, we saw that almost 56% of the prosecutors' agencies that responded said yes, they do. So that's a huge number. Um, and we would love to see that increase because we know when there's coordination, that means that we are building that safety net for survivors so that they won't fall through those cracks and they'll have access to holistic services anywhere that they go.
I think this is still a place where we might want to spend a second because Amanda put us in the mindset of the question of if there's been a 30% increase in family violence, how come we haven't seen that same increase in applying? So you're like, oh, well, this is so heartening. So many people collaborating. I have a physical copy of our report here. I know what these data points are. We're not going to name any names today, but we have access to that raw data. And if y'all been holding your breath, yes, we can share it with you. But we looked at these other responses and the places that said they didn't say yes or no, they wanted to point out, I don't think we have a resource in our area. We don't have a local program. We don't have a local family violence shelter or rape crisis center. So that's a place we might want to look and say, okay, well, is that accurate? And if it is, what can we do to bring support to that county?
There was also a big increase in this last legislative session with help from the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault and the Texas Council on Family Violence that expanded our Code of Criminal Procedure and expanded the Constitution that says that we need to, that law enforcement officers, prosecutors across the state have to provide victims of family violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking with information regarding their local domestic violence agencies, including crisis centers and shelters, legal advocacy organizations. And then it also gives very specific direction to what advocates are allowed to do and what they should be doing and how we're providing services to survivors across our state.
Okay, so this was an example of what is working. And now we want to turn and get into more detail about where do we have opportunities for improvement? Where do we have opportunities for change? First, just real high level on this slide, and then we'll get into some specifics. Real high level, Amanda, I keep stealing this line from you. I love how you bottom lined it, but when Amanda looked at the study and we were asked for her impression, she said it seems like the biggest indicator of your safety or not in Texas is your geography. We have different responses in different areas. They vary widely. And it's unfortunate that, if we're all Texans, we're all governed by these same laws, why do we have access to different protections? That's an issue. So I think there's a real system level opportunity for us to come together as a state and try to share best practices and work on getting more consistency and clarity. We also see this as a policy opportunity. I think our laws are actually pretty good. This is maybe an issue not of where we need necessarily to improve the law, but work on some policies, right, Amanda?
Yeah. When we look at policy, we really look at it within a spectrum, if you will. So some things definitely do need legislative changes. But every time we open up any statute, then we're also inviting other people and their opinions and what they think are great ideas that may not be trauma-centered and survivor-informed. And so we have to be really careful anytime that we're opening up any legislation on what is the outside forces and voices, how might they influence those types of policy change. Like Bronwyn mentioned, we have really good statutes in our state of Texas. When I've traveled across the nation and I'm talking to other states, there are some states out there that we are decades away. They are decades away from any change that is meaningful, like the spectrum of protective orders that we have here in Texas. And so I want to say that's really great. Some of the policy changes can happen at the local level. They can happen within those prosecutors' offices. They can happen with a standard coordinated community response policy changes. So it doesn't always have to be that legislative change. It can also look like policy change within our organizations and at local levels.
Absolutely. We also think that this is going to need a lot of community and partner collaboration. That's why we're hosting this town hall. Frankly, our secret goals, we do want to connect with all of you and figure out how we can come together to address this. We are hoping to use this report not just internally like we have for the last decade, but now to use it to try to, build those collaborations. Resources are tight around Texas. Places are trying to figure out where can they spend their money. And we can come together and support each other in making the right decisions for survivors. Last but not least on here, we have firearm surrender protocols. I want to pause for a second and mention something that's going to come up here and on the next few slides, and that is the concept of lethality. We have actual research and studies that show how close different factors are linked to your chance of being murdered in a violent situation. Researcher Dr. Jacqueline Campbell created her own danger assessment that you can look up, or we might be able to chat a link to it. But one of the issues that is most closely linked to lethality, in fact, it is tied with a 500% increase in your chance of being murdered, is presence of a firearm in that relationship. So firearm surrender protocols are a hot topic. I think there's a big opportunity for improvement there around the state. Our legislature did pass a law that communities need to come together and work on creating these firearm surrender protocols. Some communities have them, some don't. This is complicated. You have to figure out, there's an interest in everyone's safety in turning over firearms. People have a property interest in their own firearms. So I'm not saying this would be easy at all, but if we're going to list opportunities for change, this has to be on the list.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics. I think this is maybe the third pie we've showed you, but we teased this earlier, this idea of recency and violence. So one of the questions we asked when we called the local county and district attorneys is, does your agency require a recency and violence? Meaning they'll say, okay, well, if there hasn't been physical abuse in the last 30 days, we can't help you with a protective order, something like that, right? We have 27% of the counties saying, yes, they require that. Of those that said no, they don't require it. I love that. The others were actually pretty good on this. If I looked at the others, those responses I was pretty happy with. They said things like, well, no, it's not absolutely required, but of course we look at it, or like we factor it in, we ask about it, but it's not, we make a decision based on the whole circumstances. So I feel pretty good about the others and the no's part. You might even want to put those together. But I am concerned about the yes, because there is no research that links how recent the violence was with your risk of lethality. In fact, what is tied with lethality is help seeking. We know that the most dangerous time in a survivor's journey is after they've tried to access help, after they've called law enforcement, applied for a protective order, called a lawyer. That 14-day and then window is when you are most at risk of being murdered. So I would invite people, instead of, maybe this is a simple way of asking, like, how recent was the violence? And let's think of another way to assess lethality, because I think what they're trying to get at here is lethality. They have limited resources and they're trying to figure out who are the most urgent cases. That makes sense, but this is not the way to do it, I don't think.
No. We've all seen across the news some of the biggest headlines that we've seen on our television screens over the past couple of weeks have been two really high-profile homicides. I think what's really important to understand about those homicides is in both of those situations, those victims of those crimes had experienced intimate partner violence within their relationships, and they had either just filed for divorce and child custody, or they were about to go to court for divorce and child custody. They'd been separated from their abusers for a while. And so again, where we talk about this like recency and violence requirement, and there's no study that has shown and points to that that is what can cause homicide, we know that accessing the legal system does increase risk. And so anytime a survivor is going to apply for a protective order and that abuser is going to be served with that declaration or that affidavit, or that survivor has listed out in a public document all of the different types of abuse that they've experienced, we know that that is one of the things that can increase violence and can increase lethality for survivors.
Okay, let's turn to another one of our questions. We asked all the counties, I want to say every time we say 254 you should have a sip of your coffee. But we asked all 254 counties, do you require a police report before you'll help someone with a protective order? And this was another troubling one that we wanted to highlight for you, because many said yes, they do require that. It's almost a quarter of them said that they do require that. There are a lot of reasons why a survivor may have never called the police, right? And now something has changed and they have a window where they can go try to access safety. I think we should try to capitalize on that. Right. I have an article I wrote on why people might not be calling the police. I've shared a link with it here. There's a more iconic article from Professor Sarah Buell that shares 50 reasons why people stay in abusive relationships. You know, it's not always intuitive to us if we don't have that deep understanding of the dynamics of family violence as to why people stay, why they leave, why they might call the police, why they wouldn't. Because you know, as a regular person, we might think, oh my gosh, there's an abusive situation over there. Of course, I want them to call the police. I want to hold that person accountable and keep our community safe. That makes sense to me. But as Bronwyn Blake at Texas Advocacy Project, I don't want to put a roadblock in the way of a survivor who's trying to access that life-saving tool. So this is one I think we should spend some energy and work on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So let's talk
Yeah.
about some of this county level impact. So when we have different counties across the state, again, take a sip of your coffee, 254 counties that we were asking questions of, and have implemented these policies, what we see is that these inconsistencies are impacting survivor safety. They're impacting the timeliness of protection and long-term outcomes and safety outcomes within our communities. How are we keeping our communities safe? There's a lot of research that has shown and points to and directs to increase in the communities being unsafe when there's domestic violence, because we see bystanders who are being harmed in those different scenarios. We see law enforcement officers who are responding to the scenes of domestic violence incidents, and that is one of the most dangerous calls for those law enforcement officers to respond to. So we know that there are long-term outcomes when we are having inconsistencies in how we're applying these statutes. We also see that when survivors are delayed in being able to access protective orders, there is a direct link to their increased risk of future violence or homicide. We also see that survivors are confused. Bronwyn has mentioned, and I'll let you talk a little bit more about this, like how you've gone through and contacting each of these counties and each of these prosecutors' offices, and how confusing that was even for us as practitioners
Yeah.
trying to figure out like where do I go and what do I do?
Yeah, God bless Texas. But you know, we have counties where many of us are living now where we have a county attorney and a district attorney. And under that Texas law, you know, the district attorney might say, okay, I'll help with protective orders, or they might designate the county attorney's office to be the one to do that. We have counties in Texas where it's the same person. One person is the county and district attorney, right? We have other counties in Texas where they have a county attorney, but they share their district attorney with several other counties, you know, and so on. There's many different ways that we have this set up over the years in our state. So right away, you know, it did take some research on my part to figure out I was calling the right place. I mentioned scraping the internet for their websites. There were places that flat out said, like, don't call us, call this other agency. I'm almost happy about that. At least it was really clear where to go to get help. But I think this is a place where we can make our county safer. We can make survivors safer if we have some consistency around the state of Texas about where to go to get help. I see Kevin Dietz from Texas Legal Services Center had shared a stat that we were going to share in a second about efficacy of protective orders. The Office of Court Administration polled judges and other places, and even some judges reported that they require recency on protective orders. You can read that study yourself and see that. So this isn't any one person's problem. This is something we as a community are going to need to come together on. You know, we have, for example, there's a training TAP has on our website for dynamics of family violence aimed at judges to help them kind of see why that may or may not be something they want to require, right? So I think if all the community partners here, if we can offer our services and support to the government entities that are also here, if we work together, I think we have a lot of room for improvement.
And as we're working together, really looking at the accessibility for survivors, so it isn't confusing. So survivors know exactly where to go. They have very clear timelines of how long it might take. I think that's really important because if survivors are given different messages, if they're being shuffled from one place to another, if they're showing up at a prosecutor's office to be turned away and told to go across town, they're going to disengage from those systems. And they're not going to get the help that they need because that's super frustrating. They're already in crisis. They're already having to juggle a ton of different responsibilities in getting their children safe and getting childcare. And maybe they're getting a loss of wages because they're trying to, decide whether they should go to work or do they need to go apply for this protective order. So the more clear that we can be, the more direct that we can be about what our policies and our procedures are, is really helpful for survivors.
So we've been kind of teasing it, but we wanted to share what we're doing and where we're going with this. And this is one of the first steps is visiting with you. And we'd love you to self-select who here wants to help us and work with us on this. But even if you don't self-select, some of y'all, we're going to be calling and knocking on your door and saying, hey, can we share this with you and have a conversation?
Yeah. I might have already been knocking on your door. I've had 2 different meetings this week with different district attorneys' offices because we're trying to figure out ways that we can come in and we can partner, and expanding protective order access within communities. We know that everybody has their own restrictions, they have their own bandwidth issues, and if we can all identify that, there are more than enough survivors to go around that we can all be able to fill those gaps for survivors in more efficient and effective ways.
Yeah, we shared, the STAR report. Y'all have gotten a teaser. We shared a link at the beginning so you can read the thing in its entirety. We'll share a link at the end, and you will also, have access to it emailed to you. But we want everyone to be able to do a deep dive on this now that you've gotten the highlights because protective orders are so important.
Yeah. Here are a couple of quotes from survivors that we've served over the past few years. One survivor said, "Unfortunately, my batter only received 4 years of probation. Texas Advocacy Project prioritized my safety and well-being to secure a lifetime protective order, which has given me a renewed sense of security and peace." We mentioned this, we touched on this a little bit earlier in the presentation, but for a lot of survivors, their abusers will not be held accountable in the legal system, in the criminal legal system. They may never, first of all, domestic violence might not have been reported, so there might not be a criminal charge against them for domestic violence. But if there was, oftentimes it's being pled down, it's being dismissed completely. Maybe an abuser has to go to probation for 6 months. So oftentimes with the survivors that we're serving, we're hearing that the only justice that they received was the protective order that they were able to get. This is another quote from a survivor who said, "I knew if he had gotten the opportunity, he absolutely would have killed me. My Texas Advocacy Project attorney was able to get me a lifetime protective order. He can't step foot near me without consequences, which is so empowering. Today, I feel the safest that I have since I left. I never thought that my life could be this good after all." Okay, so with that being said, we're going to open it up for questions. Again, that full report, we only touched on a few of the different statistics and responses that we received from the prosecutors' offices that had responded to us, but you can read that full report at the link that's in the chat as well. But we also want to open it up to any questions that you guys might have. Amy and Camille, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my contact information in the chat so that you guys can reach out to us.
Barbara's asking a question, a suggestion for judges who focus on recency. I think that just a couple bubbles up. Barbara, there's a link to our training. This is actually mandatory for judges in Texas to take a training on the dynamics of family violence. So maybe show them our free one that they can take that'll qualify for that credit. We do address it in that training, that they need to understand that this is more nuanced. It's, for example, it's not always physical, but it can still be just as dangerous. You know, things that might not be obvious to somebody that hasn't been working in the movement like a lot of us, right?
Yeah. Sarah asked if we can explain a scenario where someone would end up with all three types of protective orders. It's a great question, Sarah. Bronwyn,
Yeah, for sure. Let's say this survivor was in a situation where someone did call law enforcement if they were alerted, you know, or witnessed this situation. So in a case where someone's arrested, say for an assault family violence charge, they're taken to the jail, they're processed in front of a magistrate. That's like if you watch Law and Order, that's the 30-minute mark of Law and Order, where they're told what you're charged with. And at that point, a Texas magistrate could say, and I'm issuing a magistrate's order of emergency protection. You need to stay away from this protected address. Magistrate's orders of emergency protection will keep an address safe for, Amanda said, different scenarios, 61, 91, or 121 days. So that can be put in place. That's meant to make a safety zone where the survivor can think, hey, do I want to go ahead and apply for that long-term protective order? And if they have, you know, let's say they're in that 91-day window and they think, I do want to apply for protective order, they can fill out this mandatory form application. Hopefully it'll be processed very quickly. They can be given a temporary ex parte protective order if they meet a certain minimum requirement that is meant to keep them safe until their hearing for the final order, because we know that's the most dangerous window, right? So let's say your hearing is supposed to be set within 14 days in almost every county in Texas. You get to that final hearing, you have to show, we have another improvement in the law. You just have to show that that violence had occurred. And then you could get that final protective order. So Sarah, that's how one person might get all three. Although, as Amanda said, there's many people that just get one of those for sure.
Camille has asked a question. Is there a division that is actively updating the Texas Protection Order Registry? I see who's responsible for it, but I have not seen that they've been as active with updating records.
I'm going to share with Camille and everyone a link to the Protective Order Registry so you can see. It sounds like Camille knows about it, but if anybody else wants to go take a peek on this is managed by the Office of Court Administration. They have to get this information sent to them by the local communities. So, you know, there's a lot of opportunity there for there to be some issues and room for improvement at the local level. But if you want to reach out, we don't run that. It's the Office of Court Administration. And they did, Kevin Dietz shared, and we've quoted in here, they did share a report on their protective order registry and the effectiveness of protective orders in Texas that was done in just 2024. So that link is up above as well if you want to learn more about that.
Jennifer's asked, what are the stipulations for a protection order for stalking?
For the stalking protective order, somebody's going to need to show that stalking has occurred or harassment has occurred. I know it's kind of a misnomer. It's called the stalking protective order, but it includes both stalking and harassment. And I can, you know, I'll point you the code, the Texas law that governs that is found in the Code of Criminal Procedure. So I can pull up those statutes and share them for you, but it's just that one-prong test, and it always has been what we call a one-prong test, that you just have to show that the violence has occurred. And it's not like a criminal case where you have to show it beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay, it's a much lower standard of evidence because the due process, it's not as much on the line. We're not trying to put someone in jail here. We're not trying to find someone like in a criminal case. It's just trying to say, well, somebody stay away from me. So less due process is required, and we only need to show that the violence has occurred by a preponderance of the evidence. So some people like to say that's just, is it more likely than less likely, right?
I'm getting that for you. So hold on, give me 1 second. I'm going to put the statute in here.
Somebody asked about timelines for orders, so I'm chatting that. Somebody else is asking about pseudonym forms. Yeah, there's a online form you can fill out if you want to use a pseudonym in your criminal case, and that should also be accepted if the local government's helping you with your protective order as well. So I can find that for you and share that.
And then do you have any information? Oh, hold on. What do you think that technologists can do to help assist in the areas that might need the most help, whether like data, analytics, or other ways? Bronwyn, you might actually have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, there's a lot of research being done right now on legal deserts. This idea that we have places where, they're kind of making an analogy between legal services and water, right? The idea that, like, wait, where are there plenty of legal resources and where is it more of a desert where there aren't as many legal resources? So we're having a debate right now of like, how can we best measure that? And should we see, like, Harvard says we should just count how many lawyers live in every county and say, like, okay, if you have a lot of lawyers in your county, then you're good. And I was like, well, what if all those lawyers don't want to help you? It's a little bit more nuanced. So I think where we could use people who can really look at that data and figure out where do we need to deploy our resources, where is there survivors that need help that aren't getting it, and we're hoping that our report can help with that.
Lots of information and questions about TDCJ or of the what used to be called Texas Vine, which is now IVSS, TDCJ Victim Services, and I'll put their contact information as who manages that system. And it's not a fail-proof system. It's not always 100% accurate. So if there's something in there that you see is not current, then please reach out to them and I will put their contact information in here. Oh, Office of the Attorney General. Oh, thank you for correcting me. There we
Okay, I'm
go.
trying to scroll back through the questions and see if we've addressed them. Sarah was asking about pseudonym forms and how that would affect the protective order entries. So the way I shared a link to our protective order database, you can see on there how it works. Survivors can opt in to have their protective order viewable on the public side of the database. TAP is one of the agencies that fought for that to be an opt-in, that survivors should be the ones who decide if their order should be viewable by the public. But government agencies can get past the password protected wall and be able to look at those protective orders. But if it's a pseudonym protective order, it's going to have that pseudonym on it. Absolutely, Sarah. So that form that I shared the link is very important.
Do we have any other questions?
I'm scrolling through.
Did we miss anybody's questions?
Somebody asked about disproportionality. We do have research that shows that different minority groups have a higher incident of different types of violence. And we also have research that shows that there is a lower incident of different minority groups being able to access services. So it's definitely a complicated situation, but there's research out there to support that issue. And it's something, we need to look at for sure.
Okay, I think we might have answered all of the questions in the chat, but we also want to be very mindful of y'all's time today because you all are very busy and it's lunchtime. And so you need to feed your bodies and your souls, please. Please let us know if you have any follow-up questions, if your agencies are interested in partnering with us, if y'all were legislators or from legislators' offices, we are happy to continue these conversations and how this study can be used to help implement better policy for survivors, more inclusive policy for survivors. We are so grateful for all of the work that you guys are doing across the state to help survivors have safe outcomes. And we are thankful for your time today. Please don't forget to fill out that survey if you can. That helps us to improve this training. And thank you all so much.